But the first order of business is to get into Trump. And I'm not going to even call it politics. I'm going to call it social commentary because that's what I feel it is. And that's where I need to get started. First, the news, the tragic news out of Washington, D.C. Wednesday night, the plane crash between an American Airlines commuter jet and a Black Hawk helicopter. All 67 people aboard the American Eagle flight and Army helicopter were killed when the aircraft collided over the Potomac River. Victims on the American Airlines flight included Russian Olympic figure skaters, youth skaters, and their parents, just to name a few. The cause of the collision is unclear, and the National Transportation Safety Board is investigating. However, a preliminary report by the FAA indicated that air traffic control staffing was, quote, not normal, end quote, at the time of the crash. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump spoke to reporters and implied that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, DEI, may have been the cause of the tragedy. Here's what President Trump said before reporters at the White House yesterday.
So as you know, last week, long before the crash, I signed an executive order restoring our highest standards for air traffic controllers and other important jobs throughout the country. So it was very interesting. About a week ago, almost upon entering office, I signed something last week that was an executive order, very powerful, on restoring the highest standards of air traffic controllers and others, by the way. Then my administration will set the highest possible bar for aviation safety. We have to have our smartest people. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. It matters intellect, talent, the word talent. You have to be talented, naturally talented geniuses. You can't have regular people doing that job. They won't be able to do it. But we'll restore faith in American air travel. I'll have more to say about that. I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they want them, they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so. This was in January 14th, so that was a week before I entered office. They put a big push to put diversity into the FAA's program.
Now, before I get to my comments, because I got a lot to say about that we just saw, I want to play some sound from New York Senator Chuck Schumer reacting to Trump's comments. Take a listen.
I just watched President Trump's news conference. Listen, it's one thing for internet pundits to spew off conspiracy theories. It's another for the President of the United States to throw out idle speculation as bodies are still being recovered and families still being notified. It just turns your stomach.
Amen. Amen. And let me state for the record, I'm not one that usually agrees with Chuck Schumer. I don't like a lot of things he says and does personally, because I think a lot of it is pomp and circumstance and not much to do about anything. Half the time, I know how knowledgeable and formidable he is and has been in the United States Senate, but nevertheless, there are things that I disagree with him about. This is not one of them. To say that President Trump was utterly irresponsible in the rhetoric that he spewed is an understatement. You don't know if DEI had anything to do with it. He admitted he didn't know. What the hell you say it for? Why'd you open your mouth? Why would you do that? Because you see, the more he opens his mouth about stuff like that and the quickness with which he's willing to throw in DEI, it's crystallizing what ultimately your agenda in terms of your administration is really, really all about if you're going to go that direction. And let's understand what we're talking about and what we're listening to when we hear him spew this. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. Regardless of the fact that when you talk about diversity, usually women, primarily white women, benefit from such things just as they had benefited from affirmative action because they were labeled a minority. We're never including them when we're talking about this stuff. When you say diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you say DEI, you know what that means to people outside of the minority communities? Unqualified minorities. It's automatically assumed that that's who you're talking about. And nobody wants to take into account, as I reiterated and regurgitated just the other day, how did it come about? How was affirmative action? How did affirmative action ever come about? How did stuff like the Rooney Rule ever come about? How did DEI come about? DEI came about in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder by a police officer in Minnesota, Derek Chauvin, who kept his foot on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes and 20 seconds. And the other cops right near him did nothing. As this man was calling for his mama and losing his breath of life. And an uproar ensued, and protests ensued, and riots ensued, and white America couldn't deny how heinous that act was, so they stood up and they raised their hands and they said, we're listening. We want to hear you. And what they did is they engaged in overkill. Let's admit it. Let's call it what it is. We're talking business now. Overkill ensued. And what happened is you saw corporate America and beyond trying to make amends for its negligence, for its unfairness, the inequities that it had exercised, and they said, we want to make up for it. So they went into overload, and they poured money and resources into certain things, in some cases, DEI. And what you're seeing now is the scaling back of that because the momentum has died down. And you no longer have to prioritize things the way that you once did. You feel me, Aaron? You feel me, Mike? You hear what I'm saying? And as a result, now you're saying, let's get back to normalcy per se. Let's not engage in overkill. Let's not be a bit too excessive. Let's not just throw money against the wall. Money, by the way, most folks don't have. And now you're seeing the scaling back of it. And in my opinion, and it's just an opinion, there's a justification on the part of the Trump administration to hide behind DEI to justify cuts that you know inevitably have to come in order for you to shave some of the overhead that you have to have because of the national debt and beyond. With $36 trillion in debt. You really think that immigration is just about people feeling safe in the streets? We've had immigrants in our country forever. Immigrants helped build this country. That's why, for the most part, we've been proponents of folks coming across our borders. We just didn't want flagrantly open borders like President Joe Biden authenticated or okayed. But we've always had immigrants coming to this country. And we've always benefited from their participation in this country, in building this nation. So this is not new. What happens is you have an inordinate amount of bodies. And because you have that inordinate amount of bodies, you're saying, okay, that has to stop because it's costing the taxpayer billions of dollars. It's very simple when you look at it. How it's handled is where the crime kicks in. Because when you handle it the way that the Trump administration is handling it, we want the most qualified, we want the smartest, we want this, we want that. What you're really saying is, we want white dominance again. That's what you're really saying. You want white dominance. Because if you're pointing to DEI, and that's usually pointed towards quote unquote unqualified minorities, because you're always using the word qualified, as if everybody that got a position through DEI is not qualified. We know what you're implying. We know what you're insinuating. And you got folks in the administration, and Pete Hegseth, oh my God, the nerve of him to just join into the fray and give his quote about making sure qualified people have these jobs. You're the defense secretary, whose only job prior to this was as a weekend host on Fox News. I didn't bring up personal allegations against Pete Hegseth. What I said was not being qualified for defense secretary, all of a sudden going from a weekend host on cable television to overseeing a department with over 3.5 million people. That's what I'm saying. Not an accident. The nerve! The nerve! Hell, was Trump qualified to be president? If we want to get down to the bare bones of it, I'm talking about first go round. Was he? Wasn't Hillary more qualified? Just qualifications. I'm not talking about who you prefer, who you voted for. I'm just talking qualifications. Was not Hillary more qualified? But you decided to go that route anyway, right? But here we are talking qualifications. And I'm all for qualifications and having the best and the brightest, especially when it comes to public safety. No doubt about that. But what you had to bring up DEI for? Every white person was qualified? Every white person that got that job deserved that job? Every white person that wasn't hired through DEI was exceptional and the best and the brightest? You ain't got any black people, any Hispanic people that you want to sprinkle into the mix? Could you do that? Could you do that? No, you cannot. And I know why. But I'll get to that in a second, right after we hear from our sponsors.